Hello and welcome to today's screencast, which is going to be on altitude. I'm just going to skip forward to give you a visual representation of your specification so you know exactly what is needed from you. With regard to the content, we need to be aware of the effect of altitude on the cardiovascular and respiratory system, as well as acclimatization. Today we are focusing on this first bullet point, which is all to do with the effect of altitude on cardiovascular and respiratory system, specifically reduced arterial partial pressure of oxygen and impaired muscle oxygen delivery, as well as elevated heart rate and ventilation. So if we just skip forward to some key terms. The first key term you don't necessarily need to write down because we've gone through it before. It's to do with partial pressure, and it's just a reminder that this is the pressure exerted by an individual gas in a mixture of gases. For example, in the atmospheric air, which is made up of oxygen, carbon dioxide and nitrogen, the pressure that oxygen present within that mixture of gases. That is what partial pressure is, okay? Altitude, you're going to have to get this down. I want some corner notes on this. So you need a question that's going to give you the answer altitude, as well as specifically a question is going to give you the answer 2,400 meters. So altitude is simply the height of an area above sea level. That is all that altitude is. Now, we just need to be aware that acclimatization occurs, or we just need to know with regards to altitude, the level we're focusing on is 2,400 meters above sea level. Okay, so that's something we need to be aware of. Finally, this term hypoxia. So when you go from sea level to altitude, maybe over 2,400 meters, for example, some people, or you will experience potentially hypoxia or a hypoxic environment, and basically this means you're going to get a lack of oxygen supply to the tissue, and this is kind of sickness really. Okay, and this is something we're going to look at later on in your kind of A-level experience. First of all, I'm just going to show you this. You don't need to write this down, however I do need you to listen. So if we look at this altitude here in meters at sea level, for example, London Marathon, the partial pressure of oxygen in the atmospheric air is 159 millimeters of mercury. Now, the higher we go in altitude, so the further above sea level we get, the less partial pressure of oxygen we have in the atmospheric air. So for example, at the summit of Mount Everest, 8,848 meters above kind of sea level, the highest place in the world, the partial pressure of oxygen is 43. It's decreased. It's really low, which is obviously going to cause us problems when it comes to performance. Hence why mountaineers, specifically ones that are climbing Everest, will have oxygen supplies with them because the partial pressure of oxygen is so reduced in the air, in the atmospheric air. Right, okay, so if we're going to be looking at the short-term effects of performing at altitude on the cardiovascular and respiratory system, we need to be aware of a few things. First of all, the higher the altitude, the lower the partial pressure of oxygen in the atmospheric air. That is really important. The higher up we go, the less pressure, or the less partial pressure of oxygen we have in the actual atmosphere, in the atmospheric air, okay? And as I said previously, these conditions will cause hypoxia, or these conditions known as hypoxic, i.e. a lack of oxygen. So we've got sea level down at the bottom here. This is the sea. This is a mountain quite clearly. Now, partial pressure of oxygen here at sea level is 159 millimeters of mercury. The higher up we go, the lower the partial pressure of oxygen in the atmospheric air. As you can see, I'm trying to represent how it's reducing. The higher we go, we have less oxygen. The partial pressure of oxygen, is less in the atmospheric air. Hopefully that visualization helps you. The reason why I'm saying the partial pressure of oxygen is reduced is because oxygen itself is still at 21% in the atmospheric air. It's the fact that barometric pressure is reduced. Now, barometric pressure is merely the pressure within the Earth's atmosphere. You don't need to know that. All you need to know is the higher the altitude, the lower the partial pressure of oxygen in the atmospheric air. I don't know if any of you have ever been to a place at altitude or exercised at altitude. I have kind of like not unknowingly, however, I didn't think it would affect me that bad. I went to a place that was at high altitude. I went for a run and I was genuinely ill for a few days. Sickness, headaches, nausea. It wasn't a pleasant experience, and that is because the higher you go, there's a lower partial pressure of oxygen in the atmospheric air. So, short-term effects of performing at altitude, specifically now we're looking at the respiratory system. So, when we're at altitude, we get an increase in breathing rate or breathing frequency, i.e. the number of times we breathe per minute. We also get an increased tidal volume. Remember, tidal volume is the amount of air inspired or expired per breath. Now, why does this happen? Okay, so this happens because there is a decreased partial pressure of oxygen in the atmospheric air. Therefore, we have to breathe more per minute, don't we? We have to breathe in deeper. We have to breathe more times because we need to be delivering more oxygen to the working muscles, because there's a decreased partial pressure of oxygen in the atmospheric air. Therefore, less oxygen is getting to the muscles at each transaction. So this is a real problem. As I've said, there is now, so when we breathe in, there's a decreased partial pressure of oxygen in the atmospheric air. So when I breathe in now, in my alveoli air, there's a decreased partial pressure of oxygen in the inspired air, which is a massive problem for us, because ultimately means we're going to get less oxygen to the working muscles. So here is a visualization of breathing in air into the alveoli, gaseous exchange takes place. So oxygen diffuses from the alveoli into the capillary blood, gets transported to the muscle, then oxygen leaves the blood and goes into the muscle. However, what we need to be aware of is, you don't need to write any of this down, it's going to come up in a minute, okay? It's just important you listen. There's a decreased partial pressure of oxygen in the alveoli air. Okay, so breathe in air, decreased partial pressure of oxygen in the air there. Therefore, there's a decreased diffusion gradient, or there's a decreased oxygen diffusion gradient between the alveoli and the blood, which means that there's a decreased hemoglobin association with oxygen, i.e. there's less oxygen attaching to hemoglobin, which means less oxygen is getting transported to the muscle, which means that there is a decreased diffusion gradient of oxygen between the blood and the muscle, which means less oxygen is going to the muscle for aerobic energy production. Okay, so I'm going to go through that again with it actually on the screen, so hopefully it'll help you out a bit more. When we're talking about the respiratory system, we get an increased breathing frequency and tidal volume. We need to get more oxygen to the working muscles, so as we go higher up above sea level, partial pressure of oxygen is low. We're having to breathe faster and deeper. And this is because there's a decreased partial pressure of oxygen in the atmospheric air to begin with. So then when we breathe in, i.e. an increase in breathing frequency, tidal volume, there's a decreased partial pressure of oxygen in the alveoli air. This means there's going to be a decreased oxygen diffusion gradient between the alveoli and the blood, which means there's going to be less oxygen associated with hemoglobin, which means there's going to be decreased oxygen transportation to the muscle, which is essentially going to affect performance. But the real important thing here that we need to be aware of, also please just get decreased oxygen diffusion gradient between the blood and the muscle, which is going to affect performance. The short-term effects of performing at altitude on the respiratory system: increased breathing frequency and increase in tidal volume. Why? Because of the decreased partial pressure of oxygen in the alveoli air, decreased oxygen diffusion gradient between alveoli and blood, decreased oxygen associating with hemoglobin, decreased oxygen transportation to the muscle, decreased oxygen diffusion gradient between the blood and the muscle. If you need to go through this a few times, that's absolutely fine. This is what happens with regards to the respiratory system. So we also need to look at what happens with regards to the cardiovascular system. So when we're at altitude, we've already gone for that decreased air rate. When we're at altitude, we know that there's a decreased partial pressure of oxygen in the atmospheric air at that level. 2,400 meters above sea level is what we're interested in. So at that level, there's less oxygen in the air, or the partial pressure of oxygen is lower within the air. So we get an increase in breathing rate, increased tidal volume, which is going to try and help getting more oxygen to the working muscles. We also need to be aware of an increase in heart rate. Okay, So when we're at altitude, we get an increase in our heart rate. Now this is because stroke volume decreases, okay? So this happens because stroke volume decreases at altitude. I'm going to explain why in a minute. So because stroke volume decreases, our heart rate has to increase to maintain our cardiac output. Remember, cardiac output is heart rate times stroke volume. If we get a decrease in stroke volume, all of a sudden our heart rate recognizes that and increases to try and maintain this cardiac output. However, it's unsuccessful. So our cardiac output cannot be maintained due to this decrease in stroke volume. Okay, so with regards to our cardiovascular system, we get an increase in heart rate at altitude, and this is because we're trying to maintain cardiac output due to a decrease in stroke volume. Now, why do we get this decrease in stroke volume? So stroke volume, remember, is the amount of blood ejected from the left ventricle or heart per beat. Now, what happens at altitude is there's a decrease in blood plasma volume. So our actual blood plasma is made up of about 90% of water, okay? Now, our blood plasma decreases, and this is because our body increases the density of red blood cells, okay? So this is in an attempt to maximize oxygen transportation. So hemoglobin is carried in red blood cells. So what happens is, naturally, because of this decrease in air pressure in terms of the partial pressure of oxygen in the atmospheric air, our red blood cell density increases, which means there's less room for the actual blood plasma. So we get a decrease in blood plasma volume. Therefore, that means less blood is actually going back to the heart, which reduces stroke volume. So our heart rate has to increase dramatically to really help improve or increase or maintain our cardiac output. The net effect of this, the whole of it, in regards to an increase in breathing frequency, an increase in tidal volume due to altitude, the decreased partial pressure of oxygen in the air, this increase in heart rate because our stroke volume has decreased, our blood plasma levels have decreased. This means that our cardiac output is completely decreased, which has an impact on oxygen transportation to the muscle, because we've got a decrease in cardiac output, i.e. the amount of blood going or leaving the heart per minute. Due to all of that has happened there is a decrease in aerobic performance at altitude. This is short-term effects. Remember, if we all got on a plane now, very highly unlikely, flew to a place of altitude, Brazil, and went out and went for a run, straight away, all of these things would happen. We get an increase in breathing frequency, an increase in tidal volume due to the fact that partial pressure of oxygen is decreased. Therefore, we're getting less oxygen saturation with hemoglobin, less oxygen going to the muscles. This all means that we need an increase in heart rate because our stroke volume has decreased, and this is because we've got a decrease in blood plasma, so there is more space for red blood cells, i.e. for that oxygen to attach to hemoglobin. This decreases our cardiac output, this decreases oxygen transportation to the muscle, this decreases aerobic performance. Short-term effects of performing at altitude are negative. They are not good. That is really important. You know that it is negative. It is not a good thing training at altitude for short-term effects. The positives come when we talk about acclimatization, but in terms of short-term effects, it is negative. So you may have to watch this a few times. Please ensure you've got good notes on it, good questions on it, and I'll see you in lesson tomorrow. Thank you. Bye.